Okay, and welcome to the next part of the tutorial, which is the UV unwrapping of our little character here. We have the character in a default pose. We've modeled it from the last tutorial. Now we're going to teach you how to get from this stage to this stage. Okay, so let's get started. So the first thing we have to check out of all of this is whether this is set to Blender cycles. This is a very important step because when you assign the materials, what I'll be using is cycles. If you use one of the others, it'll be a different renderer. So make sure you set it to cycles. Alright, so the first thing to do is enter into edge mode and start selecting edges. Now, the reason we're selecting edges is to skin the character, as if the character will be made out of paper and cut using a pair of scissors, and the idea is to make the cuts so that the character will then be able to be laid flat out onto the surface of the ground, and we'll be able to paint onto that flat area. So what I'm doing is making cuts around the character. I'm just selecting edges such that when the pieces are nice and flat, you'll see how they unwrap when the tools do their unwrap. Okay, so we've selected some edges. Now we do edge mode and mark seam. And you'll notice as soon as I click mark seam, all of those edges turn red. Right, so what do these do? Well, they are really where we cut when we unwrap. So I've marked my seams. Now I open up a new window and change this to be a UV editor. So now this is where our images will be, and this is where our 3D model will be. I'll just tuck that away. Alright, so now the next step is to select all and press U for unwrap and select unwrap. And you'll see that in here the model is now unwrapped nicely. Now these, you can see some polygons that are very tightly packed there. That must be for the hand. I haven't finished the hand. That's the side of the face. That's the torso. That must be the soul. That must be the torso there, and that must be a leg. How do you tell what part is what? Well, in this viewport, you can unselect everything by pressing A and use the letter L to see what part is what part, which part of the character is which. And A will select everything. Alright, so the hand isn't finished, so just zoom in on the hand and hide everything so we can see what the hand looks like. We're going to cut, I generally try to cut around the palm, and so that the whole hand will lay flat on the surface. But because I cut around the palm, I'll leave it to hinge off that edge there. If I leave that connected and not make a cut, you'll notice as it unfolds like a piece of paper, it will hinge off the area I haven't cut. I'll show you what I mean. So here's my edge, mark seam. So I've marked my seam around the hand, and now when I unhide and select everything, U, and then unwrap, you'll see the hand is now unfolded nicely. There is a bit of overlap here, but I'll show you how to fix all that later. All the same tools are available in here for manipulating your mesh if you need to, including the proportional editing tool. It's the same as in a 3D viewport, but this is on a 2D viewport. But there's a new tool, not new, but a tool that I'll introduce called pins. And what you do is, if you want to try and space this island out a little bit and then get rid of that overlap area, you can see the areas of overlap. You can either manually do it like that, manually do it by moving vertices that are overlapping over the top, but it's kind of tricky because they're very close together and it's difficult to see what attaches to what. So another method is to use pins. So I'm selecting P to select some pins, and all I'm doing is making the very edges of the model as pins. Now these pins will only work on this island here. So now that pins are enabled, you can see that they're very red on screen. We go over to the menu and turn on Live Unwrap. If Live Unwrap's turned on, now watch what happens when we start moving the pins around. It's a very fluid way to manipulate. Just nominate that to be a pin and I can get it out of the way. And so I'm just getting areas of overlap sorted out by moving these pins around. And you can see now the model doesn't have any overlap for the hand. I'll probably spread that finger out a bit. Same with that finger. These are all fingers and palms. I'll make a pin in the middle, bring a bit more pixel density back into the fingers rather than the palm. I won't really see the palm that often. I'm just specifying more pins as I need them. I'll make a pin there and even the finger up a bit. It's kind of tricky to determine where the pins go, but once you're happy with it, you can select all and Alt P will get rid of all the pins, and you can go back to normal editing tools there just to make sure there's no overlap. And some of these UV coordinates are squared off. Now it's not using all of the space, so I might just try and space it out a bit better. Okay, so I'm just squaring it up here. It's difficult to see what's going on the character because there's no texture here. So let's load up a texture and then we'll be able to see what goes onto the character. Alright, so the first thing is I'll click on New, and for this sake I'll just load up a color grid and say OK. So now it sits on top of this beautiful color grid. So that's the first step. The next step is to load it into the material. So the character needs a material. Select the character and needs a new material. So select new, and remember it has to be set to cycles. That's correct. So a new material, and we have to put an image texture into the color. Disconnect that, put it into this button here, image texture, and now we're going to copy that name over here. Not copy it, but just select it. The name of this texture is My Map. My Map. We find My Map in here. And that's now loaded into the viewport, into the material. And so now we need to load it into the texture slot. Make the viewport view the texture. So there's three things to do. We load it here using new image. We make a color grid, okay. Name the image My Map 2. Choose it over here, My Map 2, and then make sure it says texture. And so now when we move these islands around, you can see how the texture coordinates slide around on the map. So you want to have them straight so that the checker is nice and squared off, and we'll do that on the arm as well just to fill up this space a bit, so we're using all of the texture map. I'll just pin down here for a little bit. Remember, pin doesn't work if you don't have Live Unwrap. It has to be checked on, and then the pins will work. But you can also just use normal mesh editing tools as well. If I turn the UV Unwrap off, the pins just operate like vertexes. So it's still, I can still manipulate the texture coordinates as if I was regularly editing but the pins are handy, so I like to use the pins. It just lets you space stuff out without having to move too much around. You don't have to have too many vertexes selected. Alright, so assuming that's all good enough, the layout of the map is good enough. I'll load a new map in here just so that I can have no color texture. So a new image, and now I'm not going to have a color grid, I'm going to have a blank, and I'm going to have a skin color. So I have to choose a sort of a pink skin color. So I'll call this my skin, and OK. And now I have to put it into the material, so I have to choose my skin. So now I'm ready to paint. Okay, so I can close this down, and obviously my character has a mirror modifier, so the painting will be mirrored, but if you don't want that, you should apply that mirror modifier and then remap. You have to remap after mirroring. Okay, so now I'm ready to go into texture paint mode, and I can start painting my character. Now, obviously this menu here is the tools menu. That's the T for tools, and I just scroll that down there and I can see lots of tools to use in here. So I can choose my two colors to paint with, which is you can sample by pressing S and clicking, and then it samples a color in the viewport. And also this color here is the other color that we can use in our paint. I'll just make that a bit redder, and I can swap between them using X. I've just got a choice of two colors to swap between. That makes painting very quick. So I'll just fill that back in skin color and darken off the areas that I think would be darkened. How do you paint? Well, this is entirely your character design. And then you might want to darken the paint a little more. And anytime you want to sample some paint off the viewport, you just press S and it samples the color underneath the eyedropper, S. So I'm just going to quickly put some paint down on this model. It's not going to be finished. You can also make the brushes different: additive, subtractive, multiply. So I want to add some more red color into the lips here. I'll turn down the strength and just add some red color into the lips and the tips of the nose, around the ears, the base of the eyes. And you can start to get a feel. I can also use additive whites to highlight, to brighten areas. But if I turn the strength too high, it's too much. These all do work in tablets, so you can have pressure sensitivity, and you can work in any painting style that you like. If you are used to painting in Photoshop, you can definitely get used to these tools very quickly because they're very similar. And you can see also, that's the 3D viewport. You can see also across here in the 2D viewport, I can also paint if I select the view to paint mode, and there's this very same tools here and in here. I don't have very much viewport, but you can see if I paint here with blue, mix strength blue, you can see it painting onto the model in the 3D viewport as well. So you can paint in 2D and 3D viewports. Okay, so that's very handy. Undo the blue hair, and I might paint in some darker hair. Just if I paint in the 2D viewport, I don't have to worry too much about the seams, how they work on the model. Alright, so just assuming that's a reasonably good paint. It's probably too far. I'm going too far down the neck here. So anyway, look, painting a model does take a lot longer than just a video tutorial. So just be careful that you don't follow this for design direction. I might add some pink back in the cheeks. Sorry, multiply that. Oh, too much. Mix. Okay, so just put some pink back into the character's cheeks there so it doesn't look too alien-like. Alright, so just assuming that's our finished texture. Now we want to try and, instead of just using paint, we can also use some texture. So just minimizing that viewport there, I can also add down the side of the toolbar, I can use some texture here. And how do I get textures into here? Well, I have to load them using the textures tab over here. So when I want to get textures, I load them into here. Now, right now we're working on an image texture that I can use that as a brush, but I don't want to use that as a brush because we haven't specified it to be a brush. It's actually an image texture instead of a brush. So we have to specify a brush texture. So when you click on brush, it asks you to find a texture. So go and find a texture from somewhere. I'll just quickly find a texture from my library. You can find it from anywhere, but I'll just find one from here. For example, I'll paint on some denim texture. Okay, so now the denim texture is loaded into the texture swatch here. It's working as a texture, so it'll work as a texture off a base color of whatever you've selected here. So now I can paint denim onto my model because I've got a texture of denim. And I better turn up the power, the strength. So now when I paint, it's a blue base of a textured denim. So it's probably a bit too blue, but I'll just put down the... Okay, so I'm painting on texture onto the character using the texture. Now, it is a mix of the blue and then dark black. That's the way a texture paints onto the model. But you can use texture as not mix, you can use it as add. So let's just get the base color. I'll just get rid of that texture and put the base color down instead onto the legs. So there's the base color of the blue I'm going to use, a royal blue instead of royal blue jeans. Okay, I can also paint on here just to get the coverage. So that's about where the jeans will come up to. Sorry, not that high. I'll just okay, and I can also paint here. Oh. Paint here onto the model so that all of the legs get complete blue coverage. And that it will actually include the feet, but I'll cover the feet later. Right, so there's all the base color blue. Now I'll do a additive. I'll get the texture back in there. I got rid of it by pressing X, but I've got it back in there. Now I'll do an additive of this pattern onto it. And you can see as I paint onto the model or onto the screen here, it adds the texture on directly to the model. And if I make the brush bigger, it changes the way the fabric is scaled. Right, so painting texture onto the model is easy enough if you load the texture using these brush swatches here. Say I want to load another one. I'll just finish the denim up the jeans, so I've got a pattern of denim there on the blue. I'll refine that a bit later. Obviously you're painting your character, so that's how I would get pattern onto his jeans. Now perhaps his t-shirt needs a different pattern, so I just get rid of that texture. It doesn't actually get rid of it, it's still available, but I'll just get a new texture, and I'm going to back to where I was. Now I'll choose a different pattern fabric, perhaps one called leather. It's just another pattern. Okay, there's another pattern. Now I want to use a base of yellow onto his shirt. So I can either paint in the 3D viewport or paint in a 2D viewport. So I know this area here is the shirt. So if I start painting, and because it's additive, I'll just close a few of these windows so I can access the brushes again. It's additive, so I'll change it to mix, and then it won't be so vibrant. It does mix a color of black versus the color you're painting, but that's just the nature of the tool. You just have to choose which version of composition you're going to be using to get the shirt pattern on. Is it an additive, or is it subtractive, or any of these are just painting modes. Alright, so there we have our texture map, and there we have our chibi with the map on it. You can see the shoe is completely, I'll make the shoes more of a black, so that the character's got a different coloured shoe. Obviously each of the intersections between the shoe and the sock, there might be some more details in there, but that's really your design. You have to make sure that, I might put in a belt. Oh no, that's the top of the jeans. There's the belt. Paint a belt across there. There might be a large white belt buckle. Which I can paint directly without texture. Get rid of that texture. Without texture, I can just paint it directly onto the model, so I can place the belt buckle correctly. Alright, very, very simple, but you can see the texture appearing on the left and also on the model. Make sure you've got texture turned on, because solid may or may not have, in object mode, solid mode you might not be able to see the texture. In texture paint mode, it will allow you to see the texture in wireframe or solid. You can't see wireframe in texture paint mode, but you just have to make sure, if you're in object mode, you can see the texture in the viewport. Alright, so now if I save my file, it doesn't save the image, so you have to save the image. You also have to save the image, and that's a shortcut of F3. Save the image as my skin, save as image. So now there's no little highlight there, and the object is now the beginnings of the paint have begun. Alright, so that's it for the tutorial. Thanks for listening. See you next time in class.